The marble hallways of the Ashworth mansion echoed with an emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill, as tech mogul William Ashworth paced restlessly through his 30-room estate overlooking the Pacific coastline. At 47, William had built a software empire worth $18 billion, revolutionizing data analytics and artificial intelligence. But all his success felt meaningless in the face of his greatest failure as a father. His 8-year-old son, Lucas, had never spoken a single word. The boy's selective mutism had baffled medical experts for years. Neurologists confirmed that Lucas possessed normal brain function and hearing. Speech therapists found no physical impediments to communication, and child psychologists had explored every possible trauma or developmental cause. Lucas could understand complex instructions, solved puzzles designed for children twice his age, and communicated through gestures and drawings with remarkable intelligence. But despite countless interventions and treatments, he remained locked in silence. The condition had consumed William's life and destroyed his marriage. His ex-wife Rebecca had blamed him for Lucas's mutism, claiming that William's obsessive work schedule and emotional unavailability had created the psychological barriers that kept their son silent. Their bitter divorce 3 years earlier had been fought over custody arrangements and treatment decisions, with Rebecca ultimately moving to London while Lucas remained in California with his father. Now, William struggled to balance his corporate responsibilities with single parenthood, hiring a succession of nannies, tutors, and specialists to care for Lucas while he traveled for business. The boy moved through their opulent home like a ghost, his large dark eyes taking in everything while his voice remained trapped somewhere beyond reach. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, Lucas's latest child psychologist, had explained that selective mutism often stemmed from anxiety, trauma, or overwhelming environmental factors. Some children retreat into silence when the world feels too loud, too demanding, or too unsafe, she'd told William during their last consultation. Lucas may be protecting himself by not speaking, but he's also isolating himself from genuine connection. William had tried everything money could buy: private speech therapists, alternative medicine practitioners, cutting-edge treatments at specialized clinics, even experimental therapies that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nothing had worked. Lucas remained as silent as the day the doctors first diagnosed his condition, a brilliant child trapped behind an impenetrable wall of silence. The household staff had learned to communicate with Lucas through sign language, gestures, and patient observation of his needs. Most treated him with professional kindness while maintaining the emotional distance typical of paid caregivers. But Lucas seemed to prefer solitude anyway, spending hours in his room with books, puzzles, and the elaborate model trains that represented his only apparent passion. 3 weeks earlier, William had hired Priya Sharma as the family's new housekeeper, a decision made more from desperation than careful consideration. His previous housekeeper had quit without notice, citing the strange atmosphere of caring for a silent child in an emotionally sterile mansion. Priya's references were excellent, her background check was clean, and she'd seemed comfortable with the unique challenges of working in a household dominated by an 8-year-old who never spoke. What William didn't know was that Priya brought with her not just exceptional cleaning skills and reliable service, but a deep understanding of trauma, loss, and the healing power of music. At 35, she had immigrated to California from Mumbai 7 years earlier, leaving behind a life shattered by tragedy to build something new in America. Priya had once been Dr. Priya Sharma, a highly respected pediatric therapist specializing in children with autism, developmental delays, and communication disorders. She'd worked in Mumbai's most prestigious children's hospital, helping families navigate the complex challenges of raising children with special needs. Her own daughter, Anjali, had been born with severe developmental disabilities that required constant care and innovative therapeutic approaches. But tragedy had struck when Anjali was 6 years old. A devastating accident had taken her daughter's life, leaving Priya broken and unable to continue her work with children. The grief had been so overwhelming that she'd fled India entirely, seeking anonymity and healing in America, where no one knew her story or expected her to be anything more than a domestic worker. For 7 years, Priya had cleaned houses and offices, finding solace in physical work that demanded nothing of her heart or professional expertise. She deliberately avoided situations involving children, unable to bear the reminders of her lost daughter and abandoned career. But financial necessity had eventually led her to accept William Ashworth's job offer, despite his household including a child with special needs. Working in the Ashworth mansion had reawakened painful memories for Priya, But it had also stirred something else, a recognition of familiar signs in Lucas's behavior that reminded her of children she'd successfully treated years earlier. His silence wasn't just mutism, it was a protective mechanism developed by a brilliant mind overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. More importantly, Priya noticed that Lucas was drawn to music in ways that his father and previous caregivers had completely missed. When she cleaned his room, she observed him positioning his model trains to create rhythmic patterns as they moved around the tracks. He tapped complex sequences on surfaces when he thought no one was watching. Most tellingly, he became completely still and focused whenever music played anywhere in the house. His entire body attuned to melodies and harmonies in ways that suggested deep musical sensitivity. One evening, while cleaning the kitchen after preparing Lucas's dinner, Priya found herself humming a lullaby her own mother had sung to her decades earlier in Mumbai. The melody was simple but beautiful, a traditional Hindi song about a little bird learning to fly, finding courage to leave the safety of its nest to discover the wider world. As she hummed, Priya became aware that Lucas had appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar sound. Usually, the boy avoided the household staff, communicating only when necessary through gestures or by fetching his father when assistance was needed. But now he stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Priya with an intensity she'd never seen before. Priya continued humming as she worked, occasionally glancing toward Lucas to gauge his reaction. The child seemed mesmerized by the melody, his usual restless energy replaced by complete focus. When she finished the song, Lucas remained in the doorway for several more minutes, as if waiting for something more. Over the following days, Priya noticed that Lucas began appearing whenever she was working, particularly during the late afternoon hours when she cleaned the common areas of the house. He never approached her directly or attempted to communicate, but his presence was consistent and deliberate. She sensed that he was listening for something, waiting for her to sing again. On Thursday evening, while organizing the living room where Lucas's model trains occupied several elaborate tables, Priya began softly singing the Hindi lullaby that had captured his attention earlier. This time, she sang the words rather than just humming the melody, her voice carrying the warmth and comfort that had once soothed her own daughter during difficult nights. Nanhi chidiya, kai se udegi tu, she sang gently, her voice filling the spacious room with unexpected beauty. Little bird, how will you learn to fly? Lucas materialized beside her so quietly that she didn't notice his presence until she turned and found him standing just 3 feet away, his eyes locked on her face with an expression of desperate longing. For a moment, Priya's voice caught in her throat as she recognized something in the child's expression that reminded her painfully of her own daughter's face during their last conversation. But Lucas's intense focus gave her the strength to continue singing, her voice growing stronger as she realized she was reaching him in ways that years of expensive therapy had failed to achieve. The Hindi words seemed to create a bridge between them, carrying emotional content that transcended language barriers and cultural differences. Mama kati hai himmat rakho, sapne haqiqat honge, Priya sang, the lyrics speaking of a mother's encouragement for her child to be brave, to believe that dreams could become reality. Mama says, have courage, dreams will come true. As she sang the second verse, something extraordinary happened. Lucas's lips began to move, not to speak, but to mirror the shape of the words Priya was singing. He didn't understand Hindi, but he was attempting to match the sounds, his mouth forming syllables he'd never heard before, but which somehow resonated with something deep inside him. Priya continued singing, her heart racing as she realized she was witnessing a breakthrough that could change Lucas's life forever. The child was not just listening to music. He was participating in it, finding his voice through melodies that bypassed the psychological barriers that had kept him silent for 8 years. When the song ended, Lucas remained beside her for several minutes, his breathing slightly elevated as if he'd just completed some enormous effort. Then, without any gesture or sign, he simply walked away, leaving Priya alone with the stunning realization that she'd just witnessed the first crack in the wall of silence that surrounded William Ashworth's son. That night, Priya lay awake in her modest apartment, torn between hope and fear about what she'd experienced. Her therapeutic training told her that Lucas was responding to musical stimulation in ways that suggested his mutism might be treatable through carefully applied music therapy techniques. But her personal trauma made her terrified of becoming emotionally invested in another child's healing journey, especially one that might end in disappointment or renewed grief. Still, she couldn't ignore what she'd seen. Lucas had responded to her singing in ways that no previous intervention had achieved, and his attempt to mouth the Hindi words suggested that music might be the key to unlocking his voice. The question was whether she had the emotional strength to pursue that possibility, knowing it would require her to confront her own losses while risking her heart on another child's recovery. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected development when William Ashworth returned home early from a business trip to find Lucas sitting in the living room where Priya's singing had occurred the previous evening. The boy was surrounded by his model trains, but instead of running them in their usual patterns, he had them arranged in unusual formations that seemed to mirror musical rhythms. "Lucas," William said gently, settling into a chair near his son, "what are you building today?" The boy looked up at his father with an expression that seemed different somehow, less guarded and more present than usual. Instead of his typical gesture-based response, Lucas pointed toward the kitchen where Priya was preparing dinner, then back at his train arrangement, then toward the family's piano that sat unused in the corner of the room. William followed his son's gestures with growing confusion, unable to interpret the meaning behind the complex sequence of pointing and train positioning. "I'm sorry, buddy. I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." Lucas's face showed a flicker of frustration, but instead of retreating into his usual silence, he stood up and walked toward the kitchen. William followed, curious about his son's unusually direct behavior. They found Priya washing dishes at the kitchen sink, her movements efficient and quiet, as she cleaned up from Lucas's afternoon snack. When she noticed William and Lucas in the doorway, she smiled politely and prepared to excuse herself from what appeared to be a father-son interaction. "Priya," William said, "Lucas seems to be trying to tell me something involving you and the piano. Has anything unusual happened while I was away?" Priya hesitated, uncertain whether to mention her singing or Lucas's response to it. Her immigration status was legal, and her employment was legitimate, but she'd learned to be cautious about drawing attention to herself in wealthy households, where any perceived irregularity could result in immediate dismissal. "I have been singing while I work," she said carefully. "Traditional songs from my homeland. Perhaps Lucas has been listening." William looked between Priya and his son, noting the way Lucas's attention focused intensely on the housekeeper whenever she spoke. "What kind of songs?" "Lullabies, mostly. Songs my mother taught me. Songs I once sang to." Priya's voice trailed off as painful memories threatened to overwhelm her composure. "Songs from India, in Hindi. They are very old, very peaceful songs." Lucas suddenly stepped forward and tugged on Priya's apron, his eyes pleading with an intensity that made both adults focus completely on him. He pointed toward the living room, then back at Priya, then made a gesture with his hands that seemed to indicate singing. "He wants you to sing," William said, his voice filled with wonder. "Lucas wants you to sing for him." Priya looked down at the boy whose expression was more animated and hopeful than she'd ever seen it, and felt her carefully constructed emotional walls beginning to crumble. I am just the housekeeper, Mr. Ashworth. Perhaps it would not be appropriate." "Please," William said, his voice carrying a father's desperate hope. "If Lucas is responding to something you're doing, I want to understand it." Nothing else has ever reached him like this. Quote, against her better judgment and professional instincts, Priya found herself following William and Lucas into the living room where the unused piano waited in its corner like a forgotten promise. Lucas immediately positioned himself on the floor near the piano bench, his expectant gaze fixed on Priya with an intensity that took her breath away. Nanhichidia, kaise udegi tu, Priya began, her voice soft and hesitant as she sang the same lullaby that had captivated Lucas the previous evening. Little bird, how will you learn to fly?" William watched in amazement as his son's entire demeanor transformed. The restless energy that typically characterized Lucas's behavior disappeared, replaced by complete stillness and focus. More remarkably, the boy's lips began moving in sync with Priya's singing, attempting to form the unfamiliar Hindi syllables. "Mama kahti hai himmat rakho, sapne haqiqat honge," Priya continued, her confidence growing as she saw Lucas's response. "Mama says, have courage, dreams will come true." But as she reached the final verse of the lullaby, something unprecedented happened. Lucas, who had never spoken a single word in his 8 years of life, suddenly joined his voice to hers in a whisper so soft it was barely audible. Nanhi chidia. Nanhi chidia. The Hindi words emerged from Lucas's lips like a miracle, his voice small and uncertain but unmistakably present. William felt his legs give way as he sank into the nearest chair, tears streaming down his face as he heard his son's voice for the first time. "Oh my God," William whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Lucas, you're singing. You're actually singing." But Lucas wasn't finished. As Priya continued the song, he grew bolder, his voice joining hers with increasing confidence, as the familiar melody gave him the framework he needed to break through 8 years of silence. "Sapne hakekat hong," Lucas sang, his pronunciation imperfect, but his voice clear and true. "Dreams will come true." When the song ended, the living room fell into profound silence as all three of them absorbed the magnitude of what had just occurred. Lucas had not only spoken but had sung in a foreign language, finding his voice through melodies that somehow bypassed all the psychological barriers that had kept him mute. William looked at Priya with an expression of absolute gratitude and bewilderment. How is this possible? How did you reach him when no one else could? Priya wiped tears from her eyes as she knelt down to Lucas's level, seeing in his face the same wonder and relief she remembered from her daughter's breakthrough moments years earlier in Mumbai. "Music speaks to parts of the brain that ordinary language cannot reach," she said softly. "Sometimes children who cannot speak can still sing. The melody carries the words when speech feels impossible." Lucas reached out and took Priya's hand, his eyes bright with an excitement that transformed his usually solemn face. "Nanhi chidia," he whispered again, this time looking directly at his father. "Papa, nanhi chidia." William broke down completely, overcome by hearing his son not only speak but call him Papa for the first time. "Yes, buddy, little bird, you're my little bird, learning to fly." Over the following hours, as the reality of Lucas's breakthrough settled in, Priya found herself explaining her background to William with an honesty that surprised them both. She told him about her career as a pediatric therapist in Mumbai, about her daughter Anjali's disabilities and tragic death, and about her decision to flee to America where she could work anonymously without facing the expectations and memories associated with her former profession. "You're a doctor," William said, his voice filled with awe and confusion. "You're a specialist in exactly the kind of condition Lucas has, and you've been working as my housekeeper." "I was a doctor," Priya corrected gently. "I lost that person when I lost my daughter. I came to America to disappear, to find work that demanded nothing of my heart. But Lucas, he reminds me why I became a therapist in the first place." They discovered that Lucas responded not just to Hindi lullabies but to music in general when combined with the emotional safety that Priya's presence provided. Over the following days, he began speaking single words in English, then short phrases, always initially through singing before transitioning to regular speech. Dr. Sarah Hoffman was called in to observe and document Lucas's remarkable progress, her professional excitement barely contained as she witnessed a breakthrough that would likely be studied in psychology journals for years to come. What Priya achieved through intuitive music therapy represents exactly the kind of breakthrough we hope for but rarely see, Dr. Hoffman explained to William. Lucas's mutism wasn't just psychological, it was neurological. The music created new pathways for communication that bypassed his anxiety and fear. But the most remarkable transformation was in the relationship between Lucas and Priya. The child, who had lived in isolation for 8 years, began following her throughout the house, singing softly in Hindi while she worked, asking questions about the song's meanings, and gradually expanding his vocabulary through musical exercises that felt like play rather than therapy. "Priyaji," Lucas said one afternoon, using the respectful Hindi suffix he'd learned from their conversations, "will you teach me the bird song again?" "Of course, little one," Priya replied, her heart both breaking and healing as she recognized how much Lucas reminded her of Anjali during her daughter's happiest moments. "But first, tell me why you like that song so much." Lucas considered the question seriously, his newfound voice still careful and deliberate. "Because the little bird was scared to fly, like me. But the mama bird helped him be brave. You helped me be brave too." 2 months after Lucas's first word, William made a decision that would change all their lives. He offered Priya a position as Lucas's full-time therapeutic companion and music teacher, with a salary commensurate with her education and the extraordinary results she'd achieved with his son. More importantly, He encouraged her to consider returning to formal practice, offering to fund a clinic where she could help other children with communication disorders while maintaining her primary responsibility for Lucas's continued development. "I'm not asking you to replace what you lost," William told her during their discussion. "I'm asking you to honor it by using your gifts to help children who need what you can give them." Priya accepted, understanding that her healing and Lucas's recovery were somehow intertwined, that by helping him find his voice, she was also reclaiming her own purpose and identity. The Hindi lullabies became a nightly ritual in the Ashworth household, with Lucas's clear young voice joining Priya's experienced one in songs that celebrated courage, growth, and the power of love to overcome even the greatest obstacles. Nanhi Chidiya, Ab tu ud sakegi tu, they sang together, the words taking on new meaning as Lucas's confidence grew. Little bird, now you can fly." Quote, 6 months later, Lucas Ashworth gave his first public speech at the annual fundraiser for the Priya Sharma Center for Music Therapy, a clinic that had already helped dozens of children find their voices through innovative treatment, combining traditional therapy with musical intervention. "My name is Lucas Ashworth," he said into the microphone, his voice clear and confident as he addressed an audience of hundreds. 2 years ago, I couldn't speak at all, but Priyaji taught me that sometimes singing is easier than talking, and that music can carry words when your voice feels stuck." He paused, looking toward Priya, who sat in the front row with tears streaming down her face. "She taught me a song about a little bird learning to fly. The bird was scared, but his mama helped him be brave. Priyaji helped me be brave too." William watched from the side of the stage, amazed by his son's transformation from silent child to confident young speaker. But even more remarkable was the change in Priya, who had evolved from a grieving immigrant working in anonymity to a renowned specialist whose innovative techniques were being studied and replicated around the world. The mute son had indeed spoken for the first time when his maid sang in Hindi, but the miracle wasn't just in the speaking, it was in the healing that occurred when two broken souls found in each other the strength to become whole again. Lucas's voice had been unlocked by music, but Priya's purpose had been restored by witnessing his courage to overcome silence and fear. Together, they'd proven that sometimes the most profound healing happens not through expensive treatments or prestigious institutions, but through the simple power of one person caring enough to sing when another person desperately needs to hear that they're not alone. The millionaire couldn't believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. Sometimes the most valuable employees aren't those with the most impressive credentials, but those whose hearts are large enough to recognize another person's hidden potential and gentle enough to coax it into the light. The Hindi lullaby had bridged not just language barriers but the gap between despair and hope, proving that love and music together could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. In finding his voice through ancient melodies, Lucas had also helped Priya rediscover her calling, creating a legacy of healing that would touch countless other families facing similar challenges. The little bird had learned to fly, and in doing so had taught his teacher that she too still had wings. 3 years later, Lucas stood before his 4th grade class presenting his project on heroes in everyday life, his voice strong and confident as he spoke about a woman who had changed his world forever. "My hero is Priyaji," he said, holding up a photo of himself and Priya at the music therapy center that now bore her name. "She was our housekeeper, but she was really a doctor who helped kids like me. When I couldn't speak, she sang to me in Hindi, and the music helped me find my voice." In the audience, William wiped away tears as he watched his son, now a talkative, confident child who sang in 3 languages and helped other children at the therapy center every weekend. Beside him sat Priya, no longer a housekeeper but Dr. Priya Sharma once again, her grief transformed into purpose through Lucas's breakthrough. "She taught me that sometimes we need different keys to unlock the doors inside us," Lucas continued. "For me, the key was a song about a little bird learning to fly. Now I help other kids find their keys too." As the presentation ended and classmates applauded, Priya felt her daughter Anjali's presence in her heart, knowing that her loss had somehow led to this moment of helping another child soar. The mute son had spoken for the first time when the maid sang in Hindi, but the miracle wasn't just in the words. It was in discovering that healing comes in many forms, often delivered by those we least expect to change our lives forever. Lucas had found his voice, Priya had reclaimed her calling, and William had learned that the most valuable treasures often come disguised as ordinary moments, a simple lullaby that unlocked a lifetime of possibilities. Sometimes the smallest songs carry the biggest miracles, and sometimes the people who serve us end up saving us in ways we never imagined possible.